All right, so thank you all for joining, and thank you, Guy Davidson, for for joining us today too, for your talk about sequential mastery of multiple visual tasks, networks, naturally learn to learn, and forget to forget. So you can start with your talk.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Vincenzo, for inviting me to chat. So today I'd like to present some work that I did with Michael C. Moser, who is currently at Google Brain and is affiliated with the University of Colorado Boulder. And we titled this work, Sequential Mastery of Multiple Visual Tasks, Networks Naturally Learn to Learn and Forget to Forget. And so the motivation for this work is in human learning. And so the way people generally learn to acquire skills happens in some sequence, and we see some degree of preservation of previous skills as you achieve mastery on a new skill. And so if you want one way to think about this, you can think about the way we teach a linear algebra course. So we're not going to throw the entire textbook at somebody on day one and expect them to be able to answer questions from all pages sequentially, but maybe first we'll introduce vectors and matrices, and then we'll introduce linear systems, and then we'll introduce the concepts of spaces and orthogonality. And at every point, we hope that learning subsequent tasks will both allow us to improve our mastery of the basic concepts, and that the basic concept makes it easier to learn new tasks. And there are a variety of fairly well-known effects when you study memory in the science of learning. So distributed and interleaved practice is a good one. So for example, when you go to school, you don't spend 1 month learning math and 1 month learning physics and 1 month learning English. Instead, we try to interleave between the subjects and hope that it helps you learn all of them better. If any of you have ever used Duolingo, for example, they employ distributed practice a lot. So they'll give you some vocabulary in a new language, and then they'll give you another thing to learn. And then a while afterwards, maybe 3 days, maybe a week, they'll send you back to that first piece of vocabulary to relearn it, under the notion that that helps you consolidate that memory. And there's also a fair bit of evidence that people acquire skills at a power law rate. So if we look at reaction times, fairly often the first few times you try to get people to do something, it takes a long time, but after a few times, this diminishes in a linear scale and log-log setting. In the setting that you all are probably more familiar with something we're going to title sequential multitask learning. So one theme that has been studied since, well, the late 80s really is catastrophic forgetting. So if we look at the accuracy on a task Y1 given some input X in a data set or task assignment D1, and then we look at what happens when we introduce a second task D2, catastrophic forgetting generally implies that when we do this sort of thing, the accuracy of task Y1 drops. Similarly, when we do meta-learning, then we're generally going to start with some initial task, Y1, again, given some X in some data set or task assignment D1. And we're going to hopefully see that as we progress from D1 to D2 all the way to Dn, the accuracy on task Yn will be something reasonable. So it won't be impossible to learn all of these tasks, and maybe even we'll learn all of these tasks better because we build on the knowledge acquired with the earlier tasks. And you can see in this formulation that we actually start at the same point from both, but they're rarely studied together. So one paper I'm familiar with that did both of these is the progress and compress paper from DeepMind a couple of years ago. But in general, the continual learning community doesn't always look at this meta-learning effect or the effect of studying the latest task. And the meta-learning community doesn't always look at, is the knowledge from previous tasks retained at all? And then humans show evidence for both of these things, right? Like we both show evidence for interference and evidence for domain knowledge helping learn skills, which is improved with additional domain experience. And if you want this thing a little bit more visually, so when we train task 1, we hope to see some forward facilitation. We might often see forward interference. In the psychological literature, this is referred to as proactive interference on task 2. And then when we train task 2, we hope not to see too much backward or retroactive interference from task 2 or task 1. The setting we explore in this paper is going to be sequential training over a series of 10 episodes. And in every episode, we're going to introduce a new task or skill. In episode N, where we're going to deviate from the standard continual learning practice, is that we're actually going to include training examples from all tasks 1 through N. And this is borrowing from the concept of a course set. You'll see, for example, this Nguyen et al. Paper. And in our baseline and simplest curriculum, we take half of the trials in every epoch on episode n and assign them to the newest task, to task n. And we take the other half and we split them evenly on the previous tasks, 1 to n-1. And we end the episode when the test accuracy on all of the tasks, not just on the newest task, is above a criterion which in this paper is set to 95%. What does this look like? So in episode 1, we have all of our tasks assigned to the blue task, or all of our examples assigned to the blue task. In episode 2, half of the examples are assigned to the new orange task, and the other half are assigned to the previous and blue task. And we might see backward interference from learning this orange task on our performance on the blue task. In episode 3, we introduce this orange task, and we take the course set and we split it evenly between the blue task and the orange task. And now we might see interference from task 3 orange to both blue, or gray to both blue and orange. As we continue introducing more tasks, in this case yellow, and so forth, we might continue seeing interference backward on all previously learned tasks. Forward interference might come in the other direction. So is it as easy to learn the orange task as it was to learn the blue task? Is it as easy to learn the gray task as it was to learn the blue and orange tasks? And so on. So what are our tasks? We generate images like these using the Clever code base. And in each image, we're going to have 4 or 5 objects. And we added additional properties to this code base such that you have 10 unique colors, 10 unique shapes, and 10 unique textures. And as you can see in the images here, we're not going to repeat in each image. So if there is a red object in an image, say in the first and third images, there will be only one red object. There will never be repetitions. Similarly with the shapes, and similarly with the textures. Our tasks are essentially yes/no responses to questions of whether or not an image contains a certain object or property. So if you wanted to translate this to a visual question answering paradigm, these would be some things like, is there a red object? Or is there a sphere? And one nice consequence of the way we define the tasks is that every image can be used for every task. So maybe in one epoch, we'll map this to the task, is there a red object? And the answer will be yes. In the next epoch, we'll map this image to the task, is there a blue object? And the answer will also be yes. And maybe in the next epoch, we'll map this image to the task, is there a purple object? And the answer will be no. And what we're going to refer to as a domain are all 10 classification tasks. So is there a red object? Is there a sphere, etc., in a single dimension. And we're not going to deal with the language processing effect of this. We're going to encode our tasks as a one-hot, and I'll deal with that a little bit when I show you the model we use. A couple more notes on the experimental design. So we're going to replicate this experiment. All 10 episodes are tasked in a dimension over each of the 3 dimensions, so color, shape, or texture. One thing we wanted to make sure we account for is the order. And so we're going to repeat what are called Latin square blocks. So in each set of replications, each task will appear in each position once. And if you take a look at this simple 3x3 example, if I say only had 3 tasks, in the first run, say the task blue will appear in the second position. In the second run, it will appear in the third position. And in the third run, it will appear in the first position. So it will be the first task we introduce. And so over this entire block, each task appeared in each position once. This does account for first-order effects of which task appears where, but doesn't account for second-order effects. You can see, for example, that blue was after red twice and before red once. And the full results that we have in the paper, we demonstrate that all of these dimensions behaved qualitatively similarly, even if some of them were a little harder than others, and so we can average over them. The model we use is just about the simplest model we imagined that could do such a task. So we have a fairly standard convnet using 4 convolutional blocks, each with more filters than the previous ones. Standard 3x3 filters, stride 1, pad 1, max pool. This is about as vanilla convnet as one could imagine. We then flatten the input after the last convolutional layer, and we concatenate this one hot task representation. So there is a unit that corresponds to, is there a red object? And there is a unit that corresponds to, is there a sphere? And a unit that corresponds to, is there a marble object? But obviously, the network a priori doesn't know which unit maps to which task. It needs to learn it. After this concatenation and flattening, we have a few fully connected layers and an output unit that maps onto the probability of yes for this particular task. One other thing we did that I'll talk a little bit later is that we also use the task input to modulate the convolutional processing, in this case in conv1. And here what we simply did is for each filter, we allowed the task to bias it. So we learned a weight matrix, a simple weight matrix from the number of tasks, which was 30, one task in each dimension, to 10 tasks in each dimension, 3 dimensions, to the number of filters in the given layer, and we'll simply use as another bias. OK, so what do we want to ask with this setting? So there are about 3.5 research questions that we try to answer in this paper. And the first one is, does such a generic model even show reduced interference and or reduced backward interference, reduced forward interference, forward facilitation, simply through this continued training? As you saw in the model, there is no specialized architecture. There's no change in the learning algorithm. The only thing we do is we allow it to continue practicing previous tasks. Second question is, if we do see some catastrophic interference, can we devise fairly simple interventions in order to reduce it? And the third question is like, are these results robust at all to how we structure our curriculum? When I say curriculum, I mean how we allocate tasks. And to repeat, that was right now, for all previous tasks split trials evenly. The newest task gets 1/2 of the trials. The previous task gets 1/2 of the trials. And as a side note that we're curious about because we like to think about people is, do our results at all parallel findings from the cognitive psychology literature? OK, before I start giving you the results, are there any questions or clarifications you would like me to make? All right, in that case, let's start seeing results. So before I show you more complicated things, let's do a couple of quick sanity checks. One sanity check is going to be around the accuracy of the newest task, that is, the task introduced in episode N or task N in each episode N. So in the plot here, what we see is on the x-axis, we have how many training trials we took on that task in that trial. On the y-axis, we have the accuracy. And in this cyan to magenta, so it's like light blue to pinkish color scale, we're going to see each task. So the brightest cyan is the first task, the light blue is the second task, the slightly darker blue is the third task, all the way to the last and 10th task in magenta. And we broadly see that there's some oddity with the first task here that appears to be a little bit harder in some cases. But afterwards, we generally see that learning each successive task is faster than learning the previous one was. And the dashed gray line is the 95% accuracy threshold. One other sanity check we can do is we can look at the accuracy of the task introduced in episode 1 on each episode N. So now let's take the task that came first. Say we started with, is there a red object? And we learn it once in the first episode, and we relearn it in the second episode, and we relearn it in the third episode. And we continue relearning it in every episode. And let's see what that does. And there's some degree of noise in the later part of the scale, which I can try and explain later if anybody is particularly curious. But the broad thing to take away from this plot is that as we continue relearning a task, going from the first time we learn a task in black, all the way to the middle times we learn a task in brown, to this like yellow copper color for the last time we learn a task, it gets much easier to relearn. And if you're wondering why do these points start at different places on the x-axis, well, here, this task occupied the entirety of training. So it got 1/2 of each epoch, which in our case is 22,500 images. Once we start allocating additional tasks, it's going to get less and less images in each epoch. So in the second, once there are 3 tasks, for example, the third task will get 1/2 of the images, so 22,500, and tasks 1 and 2 will each get 1/2 of 1/2, so 1/4 of the images, so about 11,250. By the next episode, they each get 1/3 of 1/2, so 1/6 of the original image, and 1/4 of 1/2, and so forth. And our takeaway here is that interference from other tasks on this task is diminished every time this task is retrained. But here, we've only studied the first task. And here, we've only studied the newest task on each episode. And we'd like to be a little bit more systematic than that. So if we have 10 tasks in 10 episodes, the first episode, the first task is trained for the first time. In the second episode, the first task is trained for the second time. And the second task is trained for the first time, and so forth. We can see that in episode n, each task k for k less than or equal to n is trained for the n minus k plus first time. And if you do the quick arithmetic, this gives us 55 total data points, which we might group either by which episode a task is introduced in, or by how many times each task was trained. So what do we find? The first thing we find is that broadly, domain experience leads to faster learning. So this is the task that was introduced first. This is the first time we learn it. Oh, sorry, this is the first task, newest task introduced in each episode. So in the first episode, we have only one task, and this is about how much training it took. In the second episode, the task introduced second is actually much harder to learn than the task introduced first. So we see some evidence of forward interference from task 1 on task 2. However, once we start adding task 3 and 4 and so on, we see much less interference. And in fact, after about task 5 or 6, each newest task is faster to learn than the initial task was. So we see some evidence of meta-learning. So as we acquire additional experience in a domain, we allow learning a new task faster. That's very promising. Our second main finding is that task experience on a particular task also leads to relearning it faster. So here, we're going to we're going to join the first task and every time we learn it. So this is the first time we learn the first task, and this is the second time we learn the first task. So we see similar evidence for backward interference this time from task 2 on task 1. Remember, this is the second time learning the first task. However, we see much less interference as the network continues to get practice. By the third time already, relearning it becomes faster than learning it was initially, and it is almost and always at perfect accuracy by the last few times it learns. Just to clarify, the y-axis here is in terms of how many trials it took to get to the accuracy criterion, how many images with the task the model saw. And the x-axis is obviously how many times the task was trained. So if this was task 1, what happens with task 2? If we look at task 2, we see that learning task 2 for the first time is harder than learning task 1 for the first time, which we also saw in the previous slide. But already by the second time we learn task 2, and the third and the fourth, it is much easier to continue relearning than it was. If we look at the third task, then the third task is learning the third task for the first time is almost as easy as learning the initial task was, and it's going to nicely converge in with the rest of these lines. And if we look at the rest of the task, we sort of see very nicely that both each additional task is learned faster, which we saw previously, and as we continue relearning a task additional times, we relearn it faster and faster. And if you notice, this is a log-log scale, and this is linear in this log-log scale, so we see some nice evidence of a power law-like behavior, for which there's also a fair bit of evidence in humans. A third finding we have is that task experience also gives us some resilience to forgetting. How are we going to look at that? So what we're going to do is we're going to load a model that we trained under our training paradigm on episodes 1 through n. But now, instead of training it on all tasks 1 to n plus 1, we're only going to train it on task n plus 1. So if we take a model that learned episodes 1 through 4, instead of it spending episode 5 learning task 5 and relearning tasks 1 through 4, we're going to only train it on task 5. And what we're going to look at is the accuracy of task 1 as we continue training the newest task. And we basically see it. We're going to use the same coloring scheme for how many times we've trained a task from black all the way to copper. Is that if we take a task that we've only trained a few times and then start training without this task on a brand new task, our accuracy drops very, very quickly. So by about 10,000 training trials, we're already at effectively almost chance for some of these, or barely above chance for others. But by the later by the later relearnings with this paradigm, so this is tasks that were learned, say, 7 or 8 or 9 times. So here, for example, the lightest curve is a model that learned episodes 1 through 9. And then on episode 10, instead of continuing to get practice on tasks 1 through 9, it only learns task 10. And we see that it actually can last one full epoch, so 45,000 training examples, and still be at about 70% accuracy. Cool. So this is the basic answer to our first question is yes, we do see both reduced backward interference and additional forward facilitation, perhaps metalearning, as we continue training in this paradigm with this very generic model. But what can we do about this catastrophic interference? So one intervention we found is that visual task modulation is going to help reduce this interference. So if you recall this plot that I showed you a while ago, we see this fairly clear evidence for interference with this bump in, relearning task 1 is harder than was learning for the first time, and learning task 2 for the first time is harder than learning task 1 was. What we're going to do is add this task representation intervention on this first convolutional layer that I described before. So we allow the task representation to bias every filter. And what we find if we replot this result is that these effects are almost completely gone. So if you remember this yellow sort of anomaly here, the degree to which there is a bump here is much lower, and all of this was at the cost of adding a simple bias from the task representation to the filters on a convolutional layer. If you want to look at the difference, here we simply take these two plots and subtract them one from the other, and the y-axis is no longer in log scale. Basically see the task 1 for the second time is much easier, and task 2 for the first time is much easier with task modulation, and everywhere else it's almost effectively the same. What's another thing we can do? Well, what if we reduce the task similarity between tasks? So in these initial results that I showed you, we show the results over learning all 10 tasks in the same dimension. So if this dimension was color, then it might be red, and then green, and then blue, and then purple, and so forth. And now what we're going to do is we're going to evaluate the model with different dimensions in each task. So red, followed by are there squares, followed by is there an object with polka dots on it, followed by is there a purple object. And just like previously, we're going to cycle over which task we start with. And therefore, if we go, say, color, shape, texture, then we'll have a block where we go shape, texture, color. We'll have one where we go color or texture, color, shape, and so forth for 10 tasks. The difference plot here actually shows us something really interesting. The first and second tasks are easier with different dimensions. So we again see that it is just like with the visual modulation, learning the second task for the first time is easier when these tasks are different. Learning the first task for the second time is easier. So perhaps if you need to learn red and then also learn square, it's easier to retain your knowledge of is there a red object, and if you need to learn is there a red object, and then is there a green object. However, and this is kind of neat, by the third task, having all tasks in the same dimension is already better and easier. So what that is, once we learn is there a red object and is there a green object, learning is there a blue object is already easier than learning, say, is there a polka dotted object after red and square, which we found a little surprising and pretty cool that it only takes a third task to eliminate, to essentially by the third task, we start seeing forward facilitation on the newest task. And task 4 onwards are, again, almost effectively identical. So one more thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is that we wanted to make sure that this is not an artifact of how we structured our curriculum. So in episode E, we're going to devote P sub k training trials, or the proportion P sub k of training trials to task k. And so just to put this mathematically and like pretty simply, in our baseline curriculum, PE, the proportion allotted to the newest task, is always 1/2. And the ratio between PI and PI minus 1, so every successive pair of tasks is always going to be 1 for I smaller than me. So we gave all previous tasks the same and even split, and we assigned half to the newest task. One option we looked at is using some sort of ratio curriculum. So in this curriculum, we fix the proportion assigned to the newest task again to 1/2. But now we set a ratio for what should be, so if we take the course set tasks, how should we allocate them between previous tasks? And when we try to do a fit from our data to what sort of ratio would be optimal here, I believe we got about 1.25. And we also decided to test a value of ratio alpha of 1.5, just to get a sense for how sensitive are these results to the particular choice of value of the parameter of our ratio curriculum. And obviously, what we'll do is we'll take all of these proportions, we'll take the number of course set examples that we have in each epoch, and we'll normalize such that the 1/2 that are allocated to the newest task and all of the ones that are allocated to the previous task add up to the number of images we have. Similarly, we also tried a power curriculum in which the proportion allocated to each task is proportional to how many tasks there are in total, which task we're talking about, +1 just to make the numbers come out, and to the minus beta. And again, if we fit this thing, we take this thing, we normalize it such that these proportions add up to 1. And when I fit it to the data, it seemed to suggest that a beta of about 1.14 is optimal. And I think we actually also tried beta of 2 and not beta of 1.5, and I'll see that in the next slide. The nice discovery is that these results are actually fairly robust to how we specify the curriculum. So if on our left we have our baseline results, in the middle we have the results with a ratio curriculum with alpha set to 1.25, and on the right we have the results with the power curriculum with beta set to 1.13. There's some differences. It does appear that the first task is a little bit harder to continue relearning with the power curriculum than the other tasks, but by and large, qualitatively, this doesn't inspire us to think that these behave particularly similarly. And then one more thing is, if we now look at the total cumulative number of training trials as we progress through episodes, we found that as long as we kept the curriculum parameters reasonable, these results were about the same. If you look at the spread between the baseline curriculum and the 2 slightly optimized curriculum, so the ratio in orange and the power in pink. And then there are the 2 slightly misspecified, intentionally misspecified curricula, one in purple for the ratio and one in green for the power, and those behave a little bit worse. But it appears that as long as we do a reasonable job of specifying, we don't see much of an effect of the exact structure of the curriculum here. One quick aside that I'll give you, the set of results that we found a little curious, is that how does MAML, so Model Agnostic Metalearning, Finn et al. 2017, do in this paradigm? So again, if this is the baseline result, this is the same curve that we get from MAML. And if we again look at the difference, we actually find that by and large, MAML didn't help at all. It didn't even hurt. This is probably because MAML required us to reallocate some of the training examples from training to meta-training, from MAML's inner and outer loops, if that rings a bell to anyone. It may be the case that this is because this model can learn all of these tasks together, and there's some evidence that MAML, if the model is so strong that it can actually fit all of the tasks it needs to, does worse than you would expect. But either way, we found this pretty curious that we couldn't get MAML to do much better than our completely naive model. So I'll give you a quick recap of what I've told you today. So as we teach our network more tasks, we find a reduction in backward interference, so less catastrophic forgetting after the second task on the first one. We find a boost in forward facilitation. So not only does relearning tasks become easier, but learning new tasks becomes easier. And this is with no specialization in architecture and with a training paradigm that roughly corresponds to human educational scenarios. This happens only after the second task, which means that if you ever study such a thing with only 2 tasks, then you're probably doing yourself a disservice. And that this is roughly independently from the specification of the curriculum. And that if you want to mitigate interference, you should look at both having tasks that are less similar, but also allowing tasks to modulate processing as early as possible. Told you we're also interested in the cognitive psychology of this. And so here are a few pointers to similarities between our results and human learning. So the relearning savings effect that's been pointed as far back as over a century ago shows that relearning something is unsurprisingly easier than learning it for the first time, which our models show. Training across different episodes lowers interference, and that roughly gives us something that's analogous to both distributed practice, that is, you start from practicing only one task and you move to mixing in additional tasks, and it's also interleaved. The linear behavior in log-log scale looks like a power law, which is analogous to human skill learning, and Newell and Rosenblum is the canonical result on that from about 40 years ago. Reducing semantic similarity between tasks reduces interference. This is another very well-known result in the study of memory. And task-based signals modulate visual processing in a top-down fashion, and there are a bunch of results from the perceptual literature in neuroscience. And finally, a couple of curiosities and questions. So we find this curious, and we want to take some more time to think about the fact that our curriculum structure effectively appeared to have very little role. And so any changes we made there didn't impact the qualitative results much. We showed that MAML is fairly ineffective in this setting, and we became curious, and we might do this test at some point and take a couple of continual learning algorithms and throw them in this practice setting and see if practice helps them, and we expect that it would. We're wondering what else could be done to control the interference of task 2 on task 1, and how generic is this effect? If we trained on 5 tasks and then on another 5 tasks, would we still see interference? And then finally, we have limited evidence that I didn't opt to show today that learning these tasks sequentially in this form is actually easier than learning all 10 tasks simultaneously. So if you imagine, I could also split each epoch evenly between all 10 tasks and just train on 10 tasks all along. And some numbers we ran show that this is actually a little bit harder to do simultaneously than it is to do sequentially with practice. And this is something we're curious to play around with more in the future. And that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Guy, for your very interesting presentation. Does anyone have a question for Guy and his talk?
Yeah, so I can go if no one else has questions. Sorry, I missed the start, so maybe said that. But for each task, do you provide the network with the same set of images, and what it changes is the question, or also that the input images are different between the tasks?
Yes. So what happens is we have a fixed set of input images. We have, I believe, 35,000 training images and 5,000 test images, and we never mix those. But from the training images, in every epoch, I can reassign them to any task. So I'll randomly, at the beginning of the epoch, assign each image to a task, and there's no guarantee about whether or not I will repeat or not.
Okay, thanks. Now it's clear. So why do you think that this phenomenon happens? Do you have any speculations or more than speculations on this? And do you try it with the other kind of data sets, like, for example, standard continual learning benchmarks, or do you see this effect to be general or to be specific to these data sets up to now, of course?
We didn't run this evaluation. I thought about this at some point, and it might be nice to say even take MNIST and do, I think, like the simplest continual learning data set I'm familiar with is trying to do MNIST sequentially. And so you could very easily do the same thing with MNIST, and it's fairly trivial. I don't think this is specific to this data set. Like, I don't have any evidence to tell you because I didn't run this on other data sets, but I simply think that what we're basically trying to show here is you can build very complicated mechanisms that will absolutely help you in doing continual learning. But if you can also afford, for whatever problem you have, to also keep examples for previous tasks and their labels, then you might be able to get away with having a much weaker mechanism, and in our case, no mechanism at all, and still show much better continual learning performance than you would. And so another thing you could think about doing with this sort of thing is maybe hybrid models, right? Like, you could imagine taking a continual learning algorithm and being able to use a simpler continual learning algorithm than the latest and greatest state of the art because you also give practice on previous tasks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that this is a very interesting observation, and the fact that in the external world we have a lot of, let's say, replay that is not to be embedded necessarily in our algorithms. So that's very nice. But at the same time, why do you say, Guy, that this is very related to how humans learn? I mean, because sometimes maybe we don't have access to these kind of data and repetitions from the outside world, right? In that case, how we can, I mean, these observations that you gave us are still valid, or do you think that in that case we need to to come up with some algorithms that can and strategies so that we can avoid forgetting?
Right. So I think that's a great question, and I think that if you look at classroom settings, like we take a fair bit of effort to give people these repetitions. Again, like much of Duolingo's training model is based on the notion of like we're going to distribute practice, and you're not just going to binge one set of words, or ideally you're not just going to binge one language, but also we're going to interleave and like make you come back and repeat and like that. And so there's clear evidence that this helps humans. Now, you could also try to make the analogy to replay, say, in the RL world, right? When you do most modern RL algorithms, assume access to a replay buffer, and the replay buffer will have the rewards that you got at that time. So while you don't necessarily here have access to the labels, you still have access to some proxy of how well the thing you did. And so you could imagine trying to maintain some proxy of a reward in this setting, perhaps a signal that captures some degree of the gradient symbol, some idea of not what the right answer was, but like how the network reacted and according to this image on this task, and see if that helps you. And I think that's a very fruitful direction to try and think about like what can you do to like what's the minimal amount of practice that you can add to a model that will still help it. And maybe it's the case that you only need very little practice on previous examples starting at some point. If you have the right model and you still get great benefit, that's worth the pain of keeping around labels for previous tasks.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Hi. May I know what optimizer do you use for this experiment?
I believe the answer is Atom. The full details are in the paper. It has been a while since I ran this experiment, but I have the paper open. So I will tell you more. So all of these models are developed in PyTorch. It's all Atom with a fairly standard learning rate and a little bit of weight decay. The full details for the sizes of the network, etc., are all in the paper.
Okay.
Hi, very interesting work. I had a quick, could you just give a bit more detail about how you were able to train these modulation matrices?
Yeah, sure. So all we do, there we go. So all we would do is we'd add a, in terms of how technically PyTorch and broadcasting are is delightfully elegant code, but if you imagine that I have 16 filters in the first conv layer, and so I need my output of this matrix I need my output of this weight matrix to have 16 outputs. And I have a task representation that has 30 inputs. Then add a bias that's 31. So all I need is a 31 by 16 weight matrix, and then I'm going to simply add this broadcasted to the result of each filter at each place in the image. And what that basically enables us to do is it enables the network, we believe, we never analyze the weight that this learns, for example, but it enables the network to say that a particular filter is very relevant to one task and maybe not very relevant to another task.
Right, so you're training these jointly along with...
Yeah. Okay. Everything is trained jointly and fully backprop. Like I didn't take a model that I trained and I then added this thing. I took a brand new model that from the beginning had this connection in this weight matrix, and I just trained it end to end.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Cool. Any more questions? Okay, I guess we can thank you, Guy, for this great talk again, and thank you all for joining. I've actually had already created a topic on our forum about this talk, so I invite Guy to post there his slides if he wants, and also you all to comment and add interesting questions and suggestions, insights about this talk on the forum as well. So thank you all again for joining, and see you next Friday.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
You're welcome. Bye. Bye, guys.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Bye bye.